So I don't want to start off making any enemies here. I want to just be very clear. I love Twilight. God bless the Cullens and their sad beige Mormonness. But when I sat down in front of my laptop a few days ago to watch a movie, I wanted like an old world Catholic, like velvet curtain, skull encased in gold, Jesus like bleeding out on the cross type vampire story. So I thought I would watch Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is a Francis Ford Coppola movie from the 90s. Because, you know, I'd seen Apocalypse Now and I'd seen The Godfather, and I figured that it would be a good and, you know, mostly normal movie. Well, let's just say I was wrong.
You will not by any chance go to sleep in any other part of the castle. It is old and has many bad memories.
So in honor of our Victorian story, I have taken the liberty of procuring an image of kind of where I think I would have lived if I were born at this time. It's an asylum. And watching it, I was just thinking to myself, this is what happens when a director is so famous that a studio is afraid to give them notes. And not that that's a bad thing. That has led to some of the best and strongest choices that I've ever seen. I'm just saying this was definitely a later career type of movie. And after watching it, I actually found out it was Winona Ryder who found the script and showed it to Coppola. And she was the whole reason that this movie was made. He says about their conversation, she told me she loved this Dracula script that was very much like the book. And then I thought, well, Dracula was written at the same time as cinema was invented. What if I made Dracula much in the way that the earliest cinema practitioners would have? You know, making a thing that is in fact what it is also about. Making a thing that is in fact what it is also about. Yes. So it's like an adaptation of a Gothic novel, but it's also hearkening back to the early film era, which was happening around the same time that the Gothic genre was popular. And he really went for it. Old style. Coppola figures that 99% of the movie was shot on a soundstage like they would have done back in the day. All the modeling and fake exteriors gives the whole thing a really odd, dreamlike quality. And most notably, all of the special effects were done in camera, using fun tricks like double exposure to make all those spooky ghosties. And I cannot express enough how weird this is to watch. I mean, obviously the camera effects go crazy. Just the amount of planning that must have gone into all the costumes and the miniatures and the makeup and the shots that had to line up perfectly, likely on 2 different days to make the double exposure work. And also just the amount of blood they had to make. I found a story where one crew member describes literally a river of blood flowing across the Sony lot. And it reminded me of this great video essay I watched about Thor: Love and Thunder, which basically showed how obvious it was that Waititi just figured he could, you know, fix everything in post, which makes the whole movie kind of seem like it was made by AI. It has this soulless, airbrushed quality that happens just where some part of your brain can register that what you're watching isn't real. But with this movie, it's obvious that there is no AI here. This is just pure human creation. So Gothic, yes. Reminiscent of old films in the way that it was created, also yes. And while I think that technically this is an excellent film in all ways, I was really, really impressed by the art direction, and especially the set design. It really looks like an old movie set with all of its parallel universe offness, but it also looks very much like my culturally constructed idea of an old creepy castle or a London street, which is in part created by those old movies that Coppola is hearkening back to. And since I actually hadn't read Dracula since high school, I figured they took more liberties with the story than they actually did, but it was pretty close to what happened in the book. It starts with Jonathan Harker, who gets imprisoned by Dracula. Dracula flees to London in pursuit of Jonathan's bride. Lucy's suitors, along with the vampire hunter Van Helsing and Jonathan, hunt the big bad guy down and kill him in the end. And Dracula did always seem to have some kind of obsession with Mina, and he pursues making her one of his brides, but the screenplay did add a very genuine love between Dracula and Mina to the mix. They also added this subplot where Mina is like a reincarnation of Dracula's Transylvanian bride whose death 400 years ago caused him to forgo God and become a vampire in the first place. And from the beginning, she always has this kind of weird connection to him that she can't really name until she kind of figures it out and is like, oh yeah, okay, I'm obsessed with you too. Okay, so if you've seen the movie or, you know, read the title of this video, I feel like you're kind of waiting for me to talk about the ways in which Coppola was most liberal in his adapting of the story, and that is entirely in and around how horny the whole thing is.
Fiancé, please. Please.
Yes, my love. You found me.
And listen, I know it wasn't coming out of nowhere. I wasn't a horror person growing up. My first experience with vampires was honestly reading Twilight. But just culturally growing up, you kind of get the sense that vampires are dangerous and alluring. And Coppola definitely accurately read a lot of repressed sexuality in the Gothic genre generally, and in Dracula's story specifically. There is academic literature about this, which states that Gothic fiction has always been in conversation with themes of sexuality and sexual deviance through the veil of the monster. I found two great essays about sexuality in Gothic fiction. One of them was Vampires as a Tool to Destabilize Contemporary Notions of Gender and Sexuality by Renee Vincent, who argues, from the inception of the Gothic genre, vampires had the ability to penetrate the closet door of repressed sexuality, the social heteronormative, and the gender binary. Because by their very nature, they subverted the Victorian cultural norm of a very restrictive, puritanical view on sexuality. Vincent quotes Foucault, who says of the Victorian era, that one had to speak of sexuality as a thing not to be simply condemned or tolerated, but managed, inserted into systems of utility, regulation for the greater good of all, made to function according to an optimum. And since the moralizing force of society was so strong, all these rules extended into fiction, with every good and virtuous hero abiding by a very strict set of ideals, lest the author come under fire for encouraging degeneracy, which severely limited the subject matter that anyone felt comfortable publishing. Vincent argues that Gothic fiction and all its alluring, blood-sucking vampires allows its readers to experience the thrills of sexual connotation without having to admit the possible meaning in the text. The language establishes a specific atmosphere while leaving the sexual innuendo up for interpretation. Okay, the other essay I read was a college capstone project, and I clicked on it specifically because of its title, Not Just Dead, but Gay! Queerness and the Vampire by Billy Tringali. I just thought that was so cute. So I read through his section on Dracula to see what his thoughts were and, if I agreed with them. He thinks about Dracula, but specifically his brides, as stand-ins for queer people, representing the subversion and perversion of traditional gender roles. Not only do they literally eat babies, as opposed to a proper Victorian woman whose job was to make babies, but they also pursue Jonathan Harker and subdue him in a time where women were simply not allowed to do that. But since Harker is into them and enjoys their come-ons in some kind of perverse way, even though they don't infect him with vampirism, they do infect him with a little bit of their gender queerness, because, he's supposed to be the dominant one, but now they're dominant, and maybe he kind of likes being pushed around. Or, whatever this is. Also, in the book, Tringali notes that after the defeat of Dracula, it wraps up very quickly and basically says, oh, Jonathan and Mina lived happily ever after the end, which he interprets as heteronormativity flourishing in the wake of the defeat of the stand-ins for evil queerness. And I know what you're saying, Dracula couldn't be gay. He has brides, obviously. But it is important to note that this read is intriguing, to say the least, considering that Dracula was originally released after Oscar Wilde's imprisonment for sodomy, or, in more socially correct terms, boinking a rich guy whose daddy got mad about it. Stoker and Wilde were also known to be friends. And also, even more interestingly, after Stoker's death, a few letters he wrote in his 20s to Walt Whitman surfaced, and, well, there's nothing explicitly gay about them, but it is clear to anyone with 2 eyes and a beating heart that this is a 3 a.m. notes app confession situation. And frankly, I'm stunned that he waited 4 years and then sent these in the cold, clear light of day. So sure, there's a lot of charged language and charged vibes that are quite easy to interpret as vaguely sexual in Gothic novels like Dracula. So I don't think it's too far a jump to assume that maybe there were some other social norms that Stoker had a bit of a complicated relationship with. Maybe. I could see Coppola finding a lot of repressed sexuality in the Dracula tale and thinking to himself, I'm gonna make a Gothic film, but 100 years have passed, so I think I won't be crucified for just saying the quiet part out loud. Hence him describing the whole thing as an erotic dream. And I get him saying if Gothic fiction leaves a lot open to interpretation, this is my interpretation. I'm just gonna go full horn. And even though the love story between Mina and Dracula and the overt sexuality are the biggest deviations adaptations from the original novel. I could see him almost feeling like he's honoring the Gothic spirit in some way. Winona Ryder said herself that she was interested in the character of Mina because she was dealing with a lot of repressed sexuality, and that's what made her interesting. She loves Jonathan, but it's clear that he's a little too prim and proper for her because he's still so mired in those Victorian ideals, so he kind of symbolizes the partner that Mina should want. And then there's this freak who she's drawn to against her will and seems to draw out a repressed part of her by doing a lot of probing eye contact, mainly. Her friend Lucy also seems like she's in the same boat, but she is wealthy, and that wealth and status allow her to be a little more precocious and juggle a few men around. So, here's the thing about movies where sexuality is a prominent theme. And not to be a man-hater, but just to hate a little bit, I feel like the whole movie was kind of steeped in pheromones. Stay with me. Like, Coppola had a vision, and he really injected horny into the whole thing. But I'm not sure if he did enough work to separate his horny from Dracula's horny and Mina's horny. Do you know what I mean? Basically, I think that a lot of directors sexualize women and think this is universally hot, but by either not being willing or able to understand that a stereotypically sexualized woman actually doesn't do anything for the narrative of their film, all they're really doing is making the movie sexy to people exactly like them. So instead of viewing a spicy scene through the eyes of a character, we are viewing it through the director's eyes, a voyeur's eyes. And I do not like when watching a movie that I can tell what the director is freaky about because of the stuff they add and the way they shoot their characters. You know, you can tell that some of it's for the audience, but some of it's just for them. And that should really not be any of my business. I think that Tarantino is the easiest to rag on because he's one of the most appalling examples. Like, just stop with the feet shit. Stop casting actresses and having them pour alcohol down their legs, off of their foot, and into your mouth. Like, what narrative purpose did this serve? And before you go into the comments, be real here. Anything that scene did for that movie, it could have been done another way. And also, just imagine showing up to work and having your boss ask you to do that to him in front of all your coworkers, because he was Salma Hayek's boss in that scene. And while there was nothing that egregious in Dracula, it was clear in some parts, especially with Lucy and the vampire brides, where some of it was a little unnecessary. Winona Ryder is a little young for Gary Oldman, but she's literally supposed to be hundreds of years younger than him, so I really didn't have an issue with that. The casting really couldn't be helped. It was Winona's idea, so she had to be the leading lady, and Gary Oldman is probably one of the only actors on the planet who's talented enough to not make a Transylvanian accent sound stupid. And I figured it was kind of the same problem with Keira Knightley in the Pride and Prejudice movie, where the actors were separately excellent for the roles, and it was all well and good when they were just pining for each other, but then at the end, they get together and they kiss, and it's just so obvious that she's 18 and he's like 32. And I think they had more of the same problem here, but they just kiss more, so I spent more of the movie making a stink face. And if your movie is supposed to be an erotic dream, this isn't really the face you want people making. The age gap I did not like was between the two leading ladies and Anthony Hopkins, who plays Van Helsing. The woman who plays Lucy was in her late 20s when she shot this, so like whatever, but her character is 19. And when she's sick, Van Helsing comes to her and like pets her head and goes, "Oh, she's just a child," which is fine and all, but then 2 scenes later you see her like thrusting into a werewolf. And we also just see a lot of her in ways that aren't always sexual, but enough to be like, so you admitted in your screenplay that she was a child, so why are we seeing her like this? And then also when Mina is, spoilers, turned into a devil's bride herself, she tries to seduce Van Helsing and it just works. And maybe it's like a testament to the sway of her vampiric powers, but to me it just kind of felt like an old man fantasy, and also a later season Riverdale episode where the writers just like reach a brick wall and go, okay, maybe let's just have Cheryl make out with old man Franken. They're so desperate to make another random pair of people kiss so people will write fan fiction about them. And okay, call me a prude or call me whatever, but my personal opinion on this movie, even though Coppola is one of the great directors and he knows infinitely more about filmmaking than I ever will, but I happen to think that this interpretation of the story is a little too heavy-handed to be Gothic. Is that crazy? I think that one of the best things about Gothic fiction, and in fact what makes it Gothic, are the little dances that it has to do around taboo subject matter. And maybe it's just HBO's fault that I'm coming to this at a time where cultural norms have just completely shifted, but frankly, I don't think that there's anything particularly subversive or transgressive about a naked woman anymore, especially one that's been so set up to be ogled by the male gaze. And what I like about Gothic fiction is that it's about repression, about the unconscious coming to haunt the conscious. And there is no repression or tension here. This movie captures the vibe perfectly, but I'm not sure it captures the tone. This is just full old man horn. And again, this is just a pitch, but I feel like what might have made this movie a bit more interesting, and it could still be just as visually stunning, but less like a horny old man made it, would have been to go further with the transgressive material that they were dealing with. The original Dracula seems to be concerned with anyone, but especially women, expressing sexuality at all. And since this movie was released in the 1990s, in the later years of the AIDS crisis, maybe what we dance around this time could be characters expressing non-normative sexualities. Because hear me out, wouldn't it be interesting if the metaphor was that Dracula was infecting people with his gay disease, which might be a decent parallel for the moral anxieties of the time. Also, I feel like a common moral panic even today is gay people infecting the straights, and especially the straight innocent children, with the desire to be gay. Like what people are still afraid will happen if the innocent children read books about gender. Woo. Vampires are scary in their non-shiny form because they look like a person and they act like a person, but they are perverse, and righteous conservative people have to fight them so we don't become them. And I think it might work because this story ends a lot like the book does, with Dracula and his evil brides vanquished, but then there is no happily ever after. It ends tragically with Mina crying over her love's body, and we don't know if she will ever get back with Jonathan. She seems forever changed.
When my time comes, will you do the same to me?
So I think going on with that metaphor, it can end sadly, but Dracula's influence will carry on. But also please let me know if you think this is a terrible metaphor. I think that the script might have to change a lot to make this work. Obviously, it would have to make Dracula and his vampires a lot more sympathetic, or if they're not sympathetic, a lot campier, kind of like a Frankenfurter corrupting Brad and Janet type way. But I also get it if people are like, absolutely not, gay characters have suffered enough, and we do not need any metaphorical ties to vampirism. So let's just leave this to the straights. And that is valid. So for all this, I don't think I've really been trying to hate on the movie. It was visually stunning. The art design was impeccable. I wasn't mad about anything, but thematically there wasn't anything that I was incredibly interested in. I think we're honestly losing that transgressive aspect of the genre. And I get why this movie was so steeped in pheromones. He wanted to bring that aspect of the Gothic vibe out into the light and celebrate with a raunchiness that Stoker would have been imprisoned for even suggesting. But in my eyes, it's just not really transgressive enough, even for the 90s. So yeah, your Dracula can be as debaucherous as you want him to be. If you're gonna make it this spicy, at least make it gay.